Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting caught up on Excalibur, and it's been a little while since we covered this, right? I feel like we need to get caught up on everything going on with the X-Men and all that kind of stuff. I meant to get caught back up on it, but then I forgot, and like other stuff was going on, and I was like, okay, so like we'll cover that stuff, and I kept meaning to come back, and it kept getting postponed. So we'll also cover the Marauders, and then I think we need to finish, what are the ones we need to finish? I think we need to finish Fallen Angels. And I thought we were caught up on New Mutants. Maybe we're not. I'll have to double check. But we end up picking up here with basically like Jubilee and what's effectively the Excalibur team showing up at Buckingham Palace. Now remember, they were invited here by the Queen. Right, that's where we left off on the last video, that we had Pete Wisdom, who was sent as an emissary, more or less, from Britain to Betsy Braddock, to Jubilee, to Gambit, and so on, in order to bring them to Buckingham Palace, so a conversation could be had between Betsy Braddock and the Queen. And the reason why is because with Brian Braddock more or less missing, right? People don't, unless you're part of the core team, you don't really know where he is. And Betsy Braddock taking his place, Britain as a whole seemed to rebuke the idea that Betsy Braddock was Captain Britain, right? Britain had come to believe or had come to see Brian Braddock as Captain Britain. It's the character they were used to. And so the result of that is because of the fact that Betsy's taken his place, the question is, where's Brian? Bring him back, right? In a lot of ways, it was kind of I guess an allegory to like fan sentiment to a degree. But you end up having a fight that breaks out between like Gambit and the people who are here, right? Because as we know, for the most part, in addition to everything going on here with regards to Excalibur, with the formation of the mutant nation of Krakoa, a lot of humans out there are still fearful of the mutant population, right? They see the formation of Krakoa as mutants consolidating their numbers for the purpose of like going to war with humanity, right? So a lot of people are scared. And so you end up having somebody who throws a bottle at Gambit, and then suddenly they're met with the one thing they didn't expect: consequences for their actions. And so this leads to Gambit basically losing his mind and attacking these people to help them understand their place in the bigger picture. Now, the downside to this is it kind of continues the impression that mutants are a credible threat, right? So just kind of give you guys perspective here. Humanity's afraid of mutants for reasons they don't really even understand themselves. Somebody freaks out, throws a bottle at Gambit, he in turn attacks them, and now they're more afraid of mutants than they were before, right? So that's kind of what happened. But of course, this leads to Betsy basically calling Gambit off, and the two of them end up sort of going forward from there, right? They actually go, or I guess really the group more or less ends up kind of coalescing. And the reason why this matters is because they all basically sort of meet back up again, of course with Apocalypse there and everything else. And the important thing to understand here is that Apocalypse kind of seems to have his plan going on in the background. We don't really know what it is, but he really begins to kind of split the various individuals of the team off. Now, an important thing to understand here is this happens for a couple different reasons. The first reason is because of the fact that Apocalypse is exceedingly old. So he just knows stuff. I mean, you can't be five or 6,000 years old and like not know stuff, right? So people kind of look to him to a degree. It's like, okay, if this guy says something needs to be done, then he probably knows what he's talking about. The other part of this is that Apocalypse is part of the Quiet Council. And the Quiet Council, as we know, is basically the council that leads Krakoa. And so to receive an order from Apocalypse is to basically receive an order from the leader of the mutant population, right? So even if only for that reason, they more or less kind of have to follow it. And so what he basically ends up doing is splitting groups off, right? He starts splitting things up. He basically tells Pete Wisdom and Betsy Braddock that of course they basically need to go together in order for Betsy to attend her meeting with the Queen. And then he tasks Richter, who of course can control the Earth, and Gambit with going into the Earth and capturing some particular crystals. Now with Gambit and Richter, once they get down here, they're immediately met by the arrival of druids. Now we talked about them before. Druids are in a lot of ways minor characters in comics in this day and age. Back in like the 70s and the 80s, really more so the 70s than the 80s, and even if you go way back in like the 1940s, and when it was Timely Comics, before it became Atlas and before it became Marvel, the druids were really more prominent characters, right? I wouldn't really say prominent, they probably had more stories told about them, but basically druids are individuals who reside inside the Earth. So they're similar to the deviants in that way, except of course their origin is not the same as the deviants, and of course they don't look the same. Basically it's one of these things where where Richter and Gambit have been tasked with entering the realm of the druids and stealing these crystals, stealing particular crystals. Now once they locate them, of course kind of fleeing and dodging the druids where they can, the druids finally catch up to them. And when they come across Richter, they recognize him as somebody with control over the Earth. And so they kind of see him as somebody unto himself, right? So to give you guys some perspective here, if we looked at like the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and we said, okay, you've got like the Fire Kingdom or whatever it's called in Avatar, I don't know, it doesn't matter, but like you've got the where people can do fire, right? You've got that section of the world. The Fire Kingdom.
No. Fire Nation. Earth Kingdom.
Fire Nation, Earth Kingdom.
Yes.
And then what's the leader of the Fire Kingdom called? What's that? It's the Fire Nation rather. What's the leader of the Fire Nation called? The Fire Lord?
Yes.
Okay. So the Fire King. Okay. So Mariah's an enormous fan of Avatar, right? Like, she lives and dies. Here's the funniest thing. She finished watching it on Amazon right when it was announced on right when it came out on Netflix, and then turned around and watched it again. And I was like, what's the difference? Is it like extra scenes or something? She's like, no, it's on Netflix this time. I'm like, well, what even sense does that make, right? So, okay. So to go back to our example, Gordon, you got to keep all that in. To go back to our example, you've got the Fire Kingdom and you've got the Fire King. And what you have here is let's say, for example, like all the people, for the most part, everybody who can bend fire lives within that kingdom, right? But let's say that like somewhere that's not even part of the other kingdoms, right? Just a place out there somewhere, a person's born with the ability to bend fire. That's more or less what this is with Richter, that the druids see themselves as people who can control the world, or I'm sorry, control the earth itself, and as such are their own community. And recognizing that Richter can do that, they basically consider him one of their own. Now, Richter more or less rejects it, not in really like an egregious way, right? He's not like, I don't want to have anything to do with you crazy bums down here on the ground talking about the ability to bend earth. That's not really what he's referring to, right? It's just one of these things of like, this isn't really my home, man. Like, I'm sure you guys are cool, but like, you know, this ain't my thing. Plus, like, you guys don't have Wi-Fi. So like the result of this is that they basically reveal that the crystals that were here that Gambit and Richter were going to make off with were there to be a distraction, right? The energy contained within them had long since been depleted, right? That they were there to just distract people. And so ultimately they end up handing crystals, a couple of the crystals over to Richter. And then following that, they basically kind of try to banish Gambit, right? They use their ability to control the ground to seemingly destroy Gambit, right? Just kind of send him plummeting to his death. And of course, Richter jumps after him in an effort to try to save him. Now, this is where things get pretty interesting because of course we end up picking up with the Coven of Kaba and with Betsy Braddock and Pete Wisdom. Now, the idea behind this and really Betsy's instructions from the Queen was to meet with the Coven of Kaba and get things sorted out. A little bit of an explanation here. The word Akaba is probably familiar to a lot of you guys who have been reading Marvel Comics for a long time, especially with regards to Apocalypse. And the reason why is because Apocalypse was basically raised by the Sandstormers, that were led by Baal, which is where he developed his philosophy of the survival of the fittest, things like that. But he was abandoned by the Clan Akaba. Now, the Clan Akaba and the Coven Akaba are not the same thing. The argument that's presented here is that the Coven Akaba basically hails from humans who existed in the town or the province of Akaba that existed inside of Egypt. But the idea here is that anytime they had anybody who was born to them that looked like they were a bad omen, essentially like Apocalypse did, they would kill him. In that instance, they just left Apocalypse to die in the harsh sun. But basically, they were the group, not these individuals here, but the Coven Akaba was the coven that basically ended up giving birth to Apocalypse. So I guess in that way they're similar. I mean, the coven is a modern day iteration of what the Akaba people used to be back in the day. So I guess the logical extension, right? The logical line of succession, generation after generation, basically. But the other important thing to pick up here is that they were designed to be a distraction. And the reason why is because what the Coven of Kaba is trying to do is discredit Betsy Braddock, right? To basically put her in a situation to where the Queen would actively ask her to step down. Now, I'm not super knowledgeable about the role the Queen plays in England, and a lot of you guys who are fans from across the pond, you can probably give some much better insight in the comment section. But as I understand it, the Queen, while she does have power, I think is really kind of revered as a figurehead in Britain. And so the result of that is that if the Queen were to ask Betsy Braddock to step down, because of the enormous respect that the citizens of Britain have for the Queen and the royal family, then she would say yes. She would most likely say, okay, I'll step down, and then good luck to you, man, because whatever happens, and then kind of go from there. But the other thing that we end up finding out here is that when the child of Jubilee, who's basically a dragon, more or less, can turn into a dragon, was taken to Otherworld and then breathed dragon fire, what it did is it begun to diminish the barriers between Otherworld and the main Marvel universe. And what this has done is has allowed these sort of fictional beings, right, griffins and hydras and so on, to pass from Otherworld into the main Marvel universe. And so what this means is that this is kind of a scenario where it all kind of seems to have been engineered by the Coven of Kaba alongside Morgan Le Fay for the purpose of basically making it look like the new Captain Britain is totally inept, that Betsy Braddock is no Ryan Braddock, and that basically things need to go back to the way they used to be. And so that's where you kind of have this scenario where in the midst of all this, and Apocalypse talking to Rogue, the Rogue suddenly wakes up. Now, with Gambit and Richter, we kind of jump back to there for a second. It's pretty straightforward, right, in this little tidbit in the sense that Richter basically uses one of the crystals in order to kind of siphon its power to bolster his own and then basically save Gambit. And once they get back to the surface, of course, they find all these sort of, mythical beings and monsters and so on that are just ripping everything up. And that basically leads to this interesting little dream sequence. Now, for Betsy Braddock herself, and even for the other members of Excalibur, right? For Apocalypse and for Jubilee, they're all basically trying to fight off these monsters as best they can. But for Rogue herself, in this dream sequence that she's in, which up to this point, we didn't really know what she was seeing, but in this dream sequence she's in, she's suddenly met by the arrival of a burning dog. And what ends up happening is she's kind of led to what looks like Stonehenge off in the distance, only for it to basically be the heads of various sentinels, right? And of course, Apocalypse ends up manifesting, and it's almost kind of like this fear factor, right? Like there's this kind of tug in the mind of Jubilee that something's wrong, that Gambit needs her help, right? That Gambit's basically going to fall. But the important thing here is that with Richter showing back up, with Gambit showing back up, and so on, you have this massive fight, this conflict that breaks out between Gambit and Rogue. And the reason why is because Apocalypse has been planning all of this seemingly for thousands of years, right? Moving these pieces around the board, different things like that. Now, I don't know if he's been actively planning it, or if it was a plan that he came up with and then looked around to see if it would work and realized that all the pieces were more or less in play. But the important thing to grasp here is that there are two things going on. The first is that Gambit, traveling back to this location with Richter, had come across a few telepaths, and he had asked one of them to basically tap into the mind of Rogue, right? To kind of give her a nudge and push her in the direction of waking up. The response of Apocalypse is, you've potentially screwed up this entire plan. The whole idea was that Rogue had to kind of wake up on her own, and I'm expecting these things to happen a certain way because it's been planned that way. Your actions here, your meddling, have potentially screwed all this up. I have potentially destroyed everything that I've been working on in order to try to pull off this whole scenario. And so it leads to a massive conflict between Apocalypse and Gambit. Now, Gambit's really just kind of fighting out of frustration, and Apocalypse takes him out like that, right? He literally just grabs him and smashes his head into the ground and knocks him unconscious. The other part of this is that where he was looking to basically use these crystals to kind of activate this this portal, that suddenly you end up finding out one of the crystals is drained, and that crystal that was drained was used by Richter when he saved Gambit. And so for the most part, Apocalypse is pissed because the whole mission has basically just been scrapped, right? Like everything he's been working on has been screwed up. And he even makes a comment about that, right? He says 10,000-year-old bones, which is basically what powers these crystals, right? Where they get their energy from. But he says 10,000-year-old bones gone in an accident to save a vagabond, right? Like it's like all this came crashing down because a thief basically fell off a cliff. Like, this sucks, right? He's mad, but he's like, maybe what I need is here in you, right? So he considers the idea of killing Gambit in order to achieve his goal. Now, one of the things to kind of remember here is that death doesn't really exist anymore for the X-Men, right? They can always be resurrected. When that will happen depends, because you've got a resurrection queue, right? You've got people who were expected to be resurrected at certain times, and depending on your level of significance, you can be resurrected earlier or you can be resurrected last. But of course, at this point, Rogue basically wakes up. And when that happens, she immediately lashes out, right, at the fact that Apocalypse had knocked out Gambit and was potentially intending to kill him in order to complete the ritual. And so Rogue freaks out. Rogue attacks Apocalypse. Now, when that happens, she immediately seizes control. And this is something that we've never seen happen in Marvel Comics. We've never ever seen an instance where Rogue takes the power of Apocalypse. We saw it to a degree. Now, we didn't really see it in X-Men the Animated Series. It was the power of Warren Worthington when he was a Horseman. But we've never seen that happen before. But basically, she siphons off all the life energy of Apocalypse, and he actually even goads her into doing it, right? So it's like, you have to do this. But she siphons off all the life energy of Apocalypse and basically kills him. And like, when that happens, the ritual is more or less complete now, right? Because Rogue can touch this portal, she can activate it, and using the power of Apocalypse combined with her own innate abilities, survive the whole experience, right? That's what knocked her out in the first place. And so then, of course, you basically switch over to Apocalypse being resurrected. And of course, Jamie Braddock, the really reality warping brother of Betsy and Brian Braddock, is the one that helps him along the way. And so ultimately, Jamie's like, hey man, like, do you still need me in this plan? And the response of Apocalypse is yes. Like, I need you as part of this plan now. And so what we have now is Apocalypse combined with a reality warper who are moving towards Excalibur, right? Who are moving towards Britain. And that's when things start to get wild. Because when this happens and when the portal and everything's activated, it allows Excalibur to basically pass through into Otherworld, right? To directly confront Morgan Le Fay. Now, Morgan Le Fay, again, is basically the one kind of running this show. That Morgan Le Fay was perfectly content existing in Otherworld and just ruling over Camelot, with the vanishing of King Arthur, right? Nobody knows where he is. But she was perfectly content just ruling over Camelot and Avalon and just being there, right? Just being the one running the show. It wasn't until the mutants started creating their Krakoan gates. And because of the fact that Jamie Braddock is a mutant that has the ability to warp reality reality, and because of the fact that the Braddock family line operates within the realm of Otherworld, that a gate was created to access Otherworld, that then Morgan Le Fay started freaking out. That's why she's been calling mutants witch breed. And so with that being the case, she in turn took offense to that, and that's why all of this has happened, right? She was working alongside the Covenant Kaba in order to try to fight and destroy the mutant population, or at least to destroy this Krakoan gate, and just basically send a message saying, do not make gates that basically give you access to like Otherworld, right? Do not do that. But when you've got Captain Britain showing up here, you've got Rogue, you've got Apocalypse, who's now been resurrected and makes his return, that basically what ends up happening is he kind of calls a ceasefire. Here's what we're going to do. All right, what we're going to do here is we are going to basically have a contest. The whole point of what I've been doing up to this point with regards to the crystals and all that kind of stuff was that when Rogue woke up, that Rogue would in turn be able to touch the portal and allow us entrance through the portal in order to bring an end to you, Morgan Le Fay, right? In order to like end your rule and allow us to place a mutant or place one of our mutants in your location. Such as it was, when Rogue touched the portal, she collapsed, right? And that's when all hell started to break loose. That's when you sent your forces to us, and that's where this whole conflict's been going on ever since, right? So if we kind of leave out everything that's happened between issues 1 and this one, then this is what was supposed to have happened, right? This is what was supposed to have taken place. How the conflict would have happened would have been different, but the idea here is that he basically says, one of your forces against one of mine. Your champion prize here is basically Brian Braddock, who's operating under your control. He will fight my champion, which is Betsy Braddock. And it's kind of nuts because you initially have Morgan Le Fay, who's kind of like, he's gonna kill her. And Apocalypse says, and we will resurrect her. And then Morgan Le Fay gives one of like the coolest lines ever. She says, okay, then he will fight like one whose life is precious to him. And she will fight like one whose life is cheap. It's cool because what it basically means is that if Betsy Braddock knows that she can be resurrected from the dead, she won't truly give it her all because subconsciously she'll know no matter what happens, I'll survive this. Whereas if you have Brian Braddock under the control of Morgan Le Fay, who knows that if he loses, he's going to die, then he'll fight with everything he has, right? Because at that point, he's fighting to live, right? There are no second chances. It's a cool thing. And so when the contest begins, you've basically got Betsy facing off against Brian, and Betsy doesn't want to kill him, right? She's like, I do not want to do this. Like, I do not want to kill you. I want you to live, right? Like find a way to free yourself from her control. Now, initially you had Jubilee, who almost wanted to get involved, right? But Apocalypse basically says, no, you have to stop. We're going to need this later on. But for right now, you cannot interfere with this duel. You cannot have any involvement there. You have to let them fight because whoever it is that wins this has to win honorably and has to win of their own accord. Otherwise, the result of the battle will be contested. It has to be that they won on their own, right? And so that's what ends up happening. At least to a degree, that's what seems to end up happening, right? That what you have is the two of them fighting. Betsy Braddock basically gets the upper hand on Brian, and then in turn, Brian appears to basically die from his own sword. And the implication, and it's not explicitly stated, but the indication here is that Jamie Braddock used his ability to manipulate reality to ensure that Betsy Braddock won, right? Just a small little reality manipulating nudge that led to Betsy Braddock basically impaling Brian or him falling on a sword or whatever it is that you want to call it. But from there, because of the fact that Betsy seems to have won through legitimate means, of course, Shogo's fire breath opens fire, basically, sends the forces of Morgan Le Fay into retreat. And then from there, the question of Morgan is, well, now what? And Apocalypse says, like, you are now going to live in exile. Jamie Braddock activates his powers and she's just kind of left in a prison, right? She's literally put in this cell. And then from there, Jamie Braddock is basically instructed by Betsy to resurrect Brian. And so all of this was the working of Apocalypse. All of this was planned by him. The idea that it would all basically work out in the end. And that's one of the reasons why Apocalypse becoming a good guy is actually so cool. Whenever we think about the plans of Apocalypse, they're always nefarious, right? They're always plans of him performing evil deeds. But more so than that, Apocalypse was never really written as a character that would have these grand plans that would stretch on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and then would come to fruition at some point in time, right? Apocalypse was always kind of written as a villain who would just come up with this plan all of a sudden, and then like use his horsemen to try to see if it could be achieved, and then his horsemen would fail, and then he would just give up. And it's kind of interesting because under any normal circumstance, Apocalypse could just kind of obliterate virtually anybody, right? Shy of like Jamie Braddock, who can warp reality, or some other reality warping character like Franklin Richards. Aside from something like that, Apocalypse can defeat pretty much anybody on Earth. And so with that being the case, the conflict is more or less settled down, right? Jamie Braddock will basically be the ruler of Avalon. He'll replace Morgan Le Fay, and so the mutant population now has one of their own ruling Otherworld. You see how this expansion is taking place. Mutants are positioning their own kind in places of power, in strategic locations. Now, all of this seems to really continue to point to what we saw in House and Powers of X. The reason why the mutants failed in their war against the man and machine armies is because they just weren't planning big enough. What this does is seem to expand all that, right? Because now with Jamie Braddock running the show, the mutant population has control over the armies of of Camelot. They've got control over all the magical beasts who are there. They've got a colossal army. So it's like if Doctor Strange wanted to bring in virtually every magical being he could possibly think of in a fight against the Avengers. Who's gonna win there? And that's where things are kind of crazy, because you basically end up having this scenario where you have where you have Betsy and you have Brian, who are having a conversation with each other, right? You know, when everything kind of settles, Brian basically says that Merlin and Roma, who were the ones that originally offered him the opportunity to become Captain Britain, they appeared to him in a dream, and they asked him to make the choice: the Sword of Might or the Amulet of Right. But because of the fact that he was so filled with anger and rage over the fact that he was basically taken by Morgan Le Fay and made into a henchman of hers, that he basically chose the Sword of Might, and he believes he failed. He believes he failed the test. The reality is that he didn't, right? He just chose the Sword of Might. That's really all that it comes down to. And so ultimately, when Betsy basically says, well, then I'll give you the amulet back. I will give you that amulet back and you can go forward from there, his response is no. And when she offers another one and saying, then just don the Sword of Might, he says no, because if I don the Sword of Might, then I'm basically just a Captain Britain with a sword instead of an amulet. But people will see me as Captain Britain, and they will shun you. They will say, Brian Braddock is now back as Captain Britain. Betsy Braddock, go away. People will turn on you, and they'll see you as a pretender more so than they do right now. And so I can't do that, because ultimately people will know that I'm there. And so what she basically ends up saying is, then fine, we won't tell people. Take the sword, become Captain Britain, become the Captain Britain with the Sword of Might, become that guy. And we'll do the best we can to make sure the world doesn't know. But if it does find out, then who cares, right? They're not going to be able to split us up. We can stand against anything, right? Like, we're twins. We can stand against anything the world has to offer. And so it's a cool moment. It's a really, really cool idea here. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.